Okay, so what I want to do now is just continue basically what we started to discuss, but I want to do four of the moral standards in a little bit more detail because, as I mentioned to you before, the the purpose of learning these moral standards is to use them as part of the argument that you make in order to facilitate the option that you're going to choose in whatever problem you're going to solve. So therefore, it's kind of like critical to be able to know how to make your arguments. In addition, as well, um, I think you'll find in your work experience that speaking more professionally, using the terminology of either your industry or in this case, the content of this course, allows you to make a much more convincing argument um, rather than relying on I feel and I think, which are very easily attacked, as opposed to saying, well, let's take a look at the numbers. Let's examine the financial statement. Let's understand this from the perspective of integrity, which is one of our corporate values. All of those sentences carry a lot more powerful messaging than simply saying I think or I feel. So that's why I wanted to spend a little bit more time in this segment to kind of go over four of the moral standards that we talked about. So, as I mentioned to you regarding core values, they are also called virtue ethics, and the textbooks have a number of pages dedicated to these ideas. They are uh, the basis around which the ethical and cultural behavior of any society is based. And as we said, there are going to be good virtues and there are going to be bad virtues. The goal of an ethical manager is to use good virtues and to support those good virtues in his decision making through explaining them. So, for example, if you're going to make a decision to air condition the lounge for the benefit of the employees, in order for you to make that as an argument, it would be great if you can say, as part of our responsibility to the relationship we have with our employees, or as part of the care that we have committed ourselves to make towards our employees. That's why we're doing the air conditioning system. Then the arguments become, as I said before, a lot more powerful. So the good virtues are the things that we are trying to encourage and that we are trying to nurture in the management of our companies. And ultimately, as you can appreciate, they would result in far more effective decision making than either having no virtues that are clearly understood, or worse, um, defaulting to bad virtues. So a bad virtue might be deceit. So it's quite obvious how not being truthful in your communication is certainly not going to encourage the partnership that you have with either your employees, your shareholders, or your customers if they discover that you are routinely or even singularly misleading them or or giving them half truths that seem to lead in one direction when in effect you're going in another direction. I mean, people are pretty smart and pretty sensitive to the things that they need. And so if you say things that can be observably seen as deceitful, at the end of the day, at best, you would lose the confidence of that partner in your business, and at worst, you might severely harm the business financially or from a marketing perspective. So you have to have a clarity and certainly companies that do write their mission statements and their cultural core values down deal with this issue. You have to have that front and center in terms of your thinking. Now, if you appreciate that good virtues are better than bad virtues, the question you could then ask is, what management style is going to nurture the development of good virtues versus bad virtues? So you recall we spoke about the gladiators and the warriors. The gladiator being the manager who is a single entity, and he just comes in like like the gladiator, and and he tries to win the day. The warrior is part of a team, and the basic concept of any team is everybody wins or everybody loses. So we work together and we try to draw on the strengths that each of us contribute in order to create a greater level of success. So clearly, I think it's obvious, if you have a management team that is warrior focused, everybody participates, everybody's going towards the same goals, it's going to be far more successful than a gladiator trying to make something good happen. For two reasons. First of all, a group in many ways protects each other from the weaker parts of the group. Because if someone feels that they would want to give in, well, they won't give in. Because the other members of the group will sort of say, no, no, remember, we have these values and this is our goals, this is what we want to do. So that makes a big difference. So, whereas if you're a gladiator, it's like, you know what, this isn't working. I've tried once, twice, three times, it's not going anywhere. I'm going back to, I'll just tell everybody what to do and that's going to be it. You could do that, but it destroys the team. So that's a little bit of a talk about core values and virtue ethics and how you can kind of import them into your decision making. Similarly with utilitarianism, the big advantage that it has is that because it is the greatest good for the greatest number, it forces you to consider all of the different aspects that are involved in the decision making that you're dealing with. So whereas you might say, well, I think this is what's right, if you're forced by this utilitarian approach to examine all of the components, this stakeholder and that stakeholder, and how they're involved and how they're affected, and what the implications of different decisions will be on each of them, and you kind of got to go through that exercise, I think you can see that from a utilitarian point of view, it generates a very strong argument, because you can support the argument with many of the observations you've made as you have considered the various stakeholders in the enterprise and in the decision that you're making in front of you. Also, what utilitarianism forces you to do is to think about the consequences of your choice from a wider perspective. You might have thought, well, you know what, the right thing to do for the shareholders is X. And you could be right. But when you include the shareholders and the customers, maybe the decision changes slightly or significantly. But now you're satisfying two of your constituents rather than simply just one. So thinking about the consequences generates a greater level of happiness and success in whatever your decision is going to be. Now, having this, what we call happiness kind of appreciation for the result, you have to understand that happiness, as a definition, usually is improperly defined. Happiness is not how I feel. Happiness is what I do. And if what I do is effective, that's what happiness is. And if what I do is ineffective, then that's what sadness is. So it's a very different perspective than waiting for other people to satisfy you so that you're happy. Now it all becomes dependent on you and, of course, the choices that you're making. Um, just to give you an example of how utilitarianism can work, there's a very famous, it's a legal case, London, England, approximately the late 1800s. A ship sets sail. There are 5 sailors on the boat, plus a young fella who is the assistant to the captain of the ship. Make a long story short, the ship is caught in bad weather. The ship capsizes, and the young boy is severely injured when he falls from the lookout, which is where he was stationed, onto the deck of the ship. He breaks his leg very severely. Now they're pulling everybody into the lifeboats along with this boy, but he's not doing too well. They have enough water and enough food for about 8 days. And basically on day number 9, the food has run out. The water is very sparse. And the remaining 4 sailors decide that since the boy is almost near death, they would just kill him and cannibalize his body so they could be nourished. Now, from a utilitarian point of view, that is the greatest good for the greatest number. So that's how they came up with that conclusion. The captain objected, and so they postponed it for a day. The next day, they knocked out the captain, and then they proceeded to kill the kid and eat him. The day after that, excuse me, the day after that, the ship was spotted by other sailors. They saved everyone. Of course, they saw what was happening because there was a skeleton partially eaten in the lifeboat. And when the boat docked in London again, the sailors were charged with the murder of the boy. The defense they gave was the utilitarian defense, that the greatest good for the greatest number. He was already dying. So what was the point of waiting until he actually died before we cannibalized him? And to make, again, that long story shorter, the judge and the jury ruled that the moral value of his life prohibited you from killing him so that he could serve as a source of food for you. And so they were found guilty, and the laws in England of that time was that they were hanged from the gallows, except, of course, for the captain who had been knocked out during the time. So it kind of gives you an idea of the greatest good for the greatest number certainly has its limitations in terms of its application. Next, I want to talk about Kantianism, because that is really something that I think is very effective in today's environment. Since today we are living in a society that's very socially conscious, with social media as a communication tool, it becomes very important for us to understand that the decisions we make as managers have ramifications outside of our organizations. Because one person in the organization who decides to put stuff on Facebook or Instagram or whatever it is they're using can take a private affair and make it quite public. So we have to be cognizant of that, and therefore using these principles of universalizability and respect and reversibility become a very effective tool in an organization in terms of making decisions on how they're going to deal with ethical values that happen to come up in their organization. And that's, again, in all of these cases, when you understand the problems that can occur in your particular company, then you can create policies that deal with the issues well ahead of any issues happening. And that way everybody knows what's going on. So, for example, if you're in an environment where sexual harassment can become an issue, it's far wiser to outline this is the protocol for anybody who is accused of sexual harassment. The protocol for the victim and the protocol for the one who's accused. And that's what we're going to follow. So everybody knows ahead of the game how we are going to deal with that. And that's Kantianism, because you're respecting the participants in your organization and you're clarifying for them how things get processed. Similarly, respect demonstrates to that partner called your employees how critical they are to the organization. That this has been thought out ahead of time, clarified, and this is how we're going to deal with it. All of those things make people feel like they're valuable. Finally, the last moral standard I want to talk about is the concept of entitlements. We use the heading moral rights. I probably should use the better heading moral obligations. Why? Because if you work in an organization where you are obligated to behave in a certain way, the responsibility for that behavior falls squarely on your shoulders. And it's very easy to manage. You know what you have to do, and so hopefully you do it. And if you don't, it's fair for you to get called out on it. But when you work in an organization and it's based on rights, that means these are things that are owed to you from somebody else. When you are owed something from someone else, the other person can justify their failure to delivery with a whole series of excuses. Oh, I couldn't, for example, there has to be integrity. So integrity means when you say you'll bring the report at 3 p.m. in the afternoon, it's there at 3 p.m. If you don't show up, then you can have excuses. I was interrupted, I was disturbed, I got a call from the hospital. There's a million reasons that you can have as to why you didn't deliver it, and all that happens is it causes conflict and tension between me and you, and therefore the environment and the atmosphere in the office is affected. So when we talk about these moral rights, perhaps we can think about them in terms of moral obligations and understand that although people have a right to safety and health and profitability, we also have an obligation at our various levels to deliver on those rights that we acknowledge are available in our company and make sure that there are no encumbrances and no difficulties in getting them across to the different people. So in the next little talk, I think I'm going to talk about two particular stories, and then we will have concluded this module. So